Of the more than 3 million people living in the Basque Country today, most can trace their family in the same valley back further than almost any other population in Europe. That is not an exaggeration built for a video title. Geneticists have spent the better part of a century trying to explain why a small mountainous strip of land straddling the border of Spain and France produced a population so genetically distinct from every neighbor around it that its language has no known relative anywhere on Earth. The region itself is small enough to drive across in an afternoon. 7 historic provinces split between 2 nations, Bizkaia, Gipuzkoa, Araba, and Nafarroa on the Spanish side, Lapurdi, Nafarroa Beherea, and Zuberoa on the French side, all wedged between the Bay of Biscay and the western edge of the Pyrenees. For the millions of Americans, Argentinians, Chileans, and Australians whose great-grandparents left that same stretch of coastline and never once used the word Basque to describe themselves, the story usually got lost somewhere around the immigration paperwork. Family lore says French. Family lore says Spanish, maybe from Bilbao, maybe from somewhere near the Pyrenees. Nobody quite remembers which. Underneath that vague and slightly wrong memory sits a bloodline that carries 7 distinct fingerprints, in the surname, in the blood itself, in a hotel register from Boise, Idaho, in a percentage on a DNA test that nobody in the family expected to see. If your ancestors came from that corner of Europe and the details got fuzzy somewhere around your great-grandmother's generation, these are the 7 places to look. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The surname is usually where the thread first surfaces, and Basque surnames behave differently than almost any other European naming tradition. Across most of Spain and France, a family name descends from a father's given name, a trade, or a saint. In the Basque provinces, a family name usually descends from a house. For centuries, Basque inheritance law tied identity to a specific farmstead, the baseria, and when a family needed a permanent surname under Spanish or French civil law, they very often simply took the name of that house and the land around it. Echeverria means new house. Echeverria is the same word with regional vowel drift. Goicoechea means the house up on the hill, Barrenechea means the house down below, Iturbe means near the spring, Mendizabal means wide mountain, Larrañaga refers to a pasture or a stand of gorse. Zubiaure and Zubiria both point to a house near a bridge. Aguirre, sometimes spelled Aguirre once it crossed into Spanish civil records, describes an open clearing. None of these words come from Latin. None of them come from the Celtic or Germanic roots that shaped most European surnames. They come from Euskara, and that single fact is why a Basque surname often looks unlike anything else on a page of otherwise Spanish or French names. Some genealogists have gone further and argued that even a name as common as Garcia, one of the most widespread surnames in the entire Spanish-speaking world, likely descends from the Basque word gaztea, meaning young, though the scholarship on that particular claim remains genuinely divided and should be treated as a plausible theory rather than settled fact. What is not divided is the pattern itself. If your family surname ends in aga, egi, oa, uri, or tsa, or if it visibly breaks apart into 2 smaller words describing a place, a house, or a landscape feature in a way no Spanish or French surname typically does, that structure alone is worth researching. And if the spelling in your family Bible looks slightly off from what a modern search turns up, that is often not an error. Basque surnames were frequently respelled at the port of entry or by a county clerk who had never seen the letter combination before and simply wrote down what it sounded like. Echeverria became Echeverria. Echarte sometimes became Echart. The vowel-heavy, consonant-stacked structure of the original often survives underneath a simplified American spelling, close enough to trace if you know to look for it. There is also a legal history behind why so many of these house names survive intact in records at all. Spain adopted a formal civil registry system in the 1870s, and unlike much of the rest of the country, many Basque families entering that system did not invent a new surname, they registered the name of the ancestral baseria that had already identified the family for generations, sometimes for centuries before any government asked them to write it down. Spanish naming convention also requires 2 surnames, one from each parent, which means a person can carry a Basque paternal name and a Castilian maternal name, or the reverse, and a family researcher scanning only the first surname on a document can miss the Basque line entirely if it happens to sit in the second position. A handful of other common Basque surnames follow the same descriptive logic once you know to read them that way. Bilbao and Ibarra both simply mean valley or riverside settlement. Zabala means wide or open. Ochoa likely derives from Otso, the Basque word for wolf. Elizalde means near the church. Uranga combines elements referring to water and a place. None of them were chosen for prestige or ancestry the way many Spanish and French surnames were. They were chosen because they described exactly where a specific family's house sat on a specific hillside, which is part of why so many unrelated Basque families across different valleys ended up sharing what looks, at first glance, like the same surname. The second sign rarely survives in paperwork at all. It survives in a story, usually a strange one, passed down about a relative who spoke a language nobody outside the family could place. Euskara, the Basque language, is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it has no demonstrated relationship to any other living language on Earth. It is not a Romance language, it is not Celtic, it is not part of the Indo-European family that includes nearly every other tongue spoken across Europe, from Portuguese to Russian to Hindi. Most linguists now believe Euskara predates the arrival of Indo-European languages in Western Europe entirely, meaning the language your ancestor may have spoken at home had already been sitting in that same valley for thousands of years before Latin ever reached the region, let alone before French or Spanish existed as distinct tongues. For an immigrant family in 19th or 20th century America, that made Euskara almost unusably obscure outside the community itself. A Spanish-speaking neighbor could not understand it. A French-speaking neighbor could not understand it either. Priests occasionally struggled to hear confession in it. Immigration officials had no idea what they were listening to and frequently just wrote Spanish or French on the paperwork because the ship had sailed from a Spanish or French port. If a family story mentions a grandmother, great-uncle, or great-grandfather who spoke what relatives remember only as a strange private language, unlike anything the neighbors spoke and unrelated to standard Spanish or standard French, that detail is not folklore filler. It is one of the more specific and checkable signs available because there are very few languages in Western European immigration history that fit that exact description. Basque boarding houses in the American West, of which more shortly, often ran almost entirely in Euskara for the first arrivals, with English and Spanish picked up slowly and unevenly depending on how long someone stayed. Some family surnames themselves preserve the oral memory. A relative who insisted the name should be pronounced a particular way, with stress falling somewhere Spanish speakers found unusual, was very often preserving a Basque pronunciation pattern that had already been flattened out on paper by an anglicized spelling. Linguists classify Euskara as an agglutinative, ergative language, meaning it builds meaning by stacking suffixes onto a root word rather than rearranging word order the way Spanish, French, and English do, and that grammatical structure has no close parallel anywhere else in Western Europe. The language survives today in several distinct dialects, Biscayan, Gipuzkoan, and Nafarroan, among them, standardized into a unified written form called Euskara Batua by the Basque Language Academy, Euskaltzaindia, only in the second half of the 20th century. Before that standardization, the Euskara spoken in one valley could sound noticeably different from the Euskara spoken one valley over, which is part of why relatives who emigrated decades apart sometimes remembered slightly different words for the same thing, a detail that occasionally confuses family researchers trying to match an oral fragment to a specific place of origin. The third sign is written directly into the body, and it is one of the oldest documented genetic curiosities in European population science. A landmark study published in 1949 by the researchers Chalmers, Icken, and Morant, examining blood groups across the Basque population, was among the first to formally record what local doctors had long suspected. Roughly 30 to 35% of people native to the Basque provinces carry Rh-negative blood, compared to roughly 15% across the rest of Europe, and considerably less than that across most of the globe. Blood type O also appears at unusually high frequency in the same population. That 1949 study has been confirmed and refined by population geneticists many times since, and the explanation most commonly offered today, though still debated among specialists, holds that the Basque population represents an unusually direct genetic continuation of the hunter-gatherer and early farming populations that occupied the Iberian Peninsula before later waves of migration reshaped the genetic landscape of the rest of Europe. In simpler terms, while most of Europe absorbed several major population movements over the last several thousand years, blending and rebalancing blood type frequencies along the way, the mountainous geography of the Western Pyrenees appears to have kept the Basque population comparatively isolated from a number of those later movements. That isolation is exactly why the blood type frequency stands out so sharply against every neighboring population today. If Raj-negative blood runs unusually often through one branch of your family, showing up generation after generation in a pattern relatives have joked about or worried over, without ever fully explaining it, and that branch traces to somewhere in northern Spain or southwestern France, the Basque provinces are a genuinely reasonable place to start looking. This is not proof by itself. Roche-negative blood exists in every European population at some frequency, and plenty of families with no Basque ancestry at all carry it too. But combined with a surname that breaks down into house and landscape words, or a family memory of an unplaceable language, the blood type becomes one more thread pointing in the same direction rather than a stray coincidence. The blood type pattern also left a quieter mark on Basque medical history. Raj-negative mothers carrying an Rh-positive child face a documented risk of hemolytic disease of the newborn in later pregnancies, a complication that Basque doctors and midwives encountered often enough, given how common Rh-negative blood was in the population, that some of the earliest studies of the condition anywhere in Europe drew directly on patient records from hospitals in Bilbao and San Sebastian. A family story about difficult pregnancies, or a doctor once mentioning an unusual blood type generations before genetic testing existed is, in a Basque-descended family, sometimes a faint echo of that same regional pattern. The fourth sign shows up on a screen instead of in a family story, and it is becoming the most common way people discover this ancestry today. Commercial DNA testing companies build their regional ancestry estimates by comparing a customer's genetic markers against reference populations collected from people with 4 grandparents documented to the same small region. Because the Basque population has remained comparatively isolated for so long, a 2015 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by the researcher Torsten Günther and his colleagues compared ancient genomes recovered from Neolithic farming sites in northern Spain directly against the DNA of modern Basque people, and found a genetic continuity striking enough to help explain why the population remains measurably distinct from its immediate neighbors today. That distinctiveness is exactly what produces the pattern showing up in consumer DNA reports now. Someone who grew up believing their family was simply French, full stop, sometimes opens a DNA report and finds a segment specifically labeled Basque, sitting apart from the general French or Iberian percentages around it. The same happens on the Spanish side, where a family that always identified as Castilian or Andalusian sometimes discovers a small, distinct Basque component that nobody in living memory could explain. Studies of Y chromosome variation across the Basque provinces have also measured concentrations of the R1b marker above 80% in some samples, among the highest recorded anywhere in Europe, though the precise origin and timeline behind that concentration remains an active and genuinely unsettled area of research rather than a closed case, with some researchers pointing to early post-glacial refuge populations and others favoring later Neolithic and Bronze Age arrivals as the more likely source. None of this means a DNA percentage alone proves your family's story. Ancestry estimates shift as reference databases grow, and a small regional percentage can sometimes reflect broader population overlap rather than a direct, documentable Basque line. What it does mean is that a Basque result appearing on a modern DNA test, especially one that surprises a family who always assumed a simpler, more generic French or Spanish identity, is grounded in real and measurable population genetics, not a marketing gimmick built to sell test kits. Mitochondrial DNA, which traces the direct maternal line, tells a similar story. Haplogroup H, the most common mitochondrial lineage across all of Western Europe, appears at an even higher frequency in the Basque population than in most of the surrounding regions. Another marker consistent with a population that absorbed fewer later migrations than its neighbors. None of these individual markers is unique to Basque ancestry on its own, since haplogroup H turns up across the continent, but the combination of an elevated Rh-negative frequency, a distinct autosomal cluster, and a dense concentration of R1b on the paternal side is unusual enough as a set that population geneticists treat the Basque region as one of the clearer genetic outliers anywhere in Europe. Put those 4 signs together, and the genetic and linguistic case starts to build itself before a single archival record turns up. A surname built from house and landscape words, a family memory of an untraceable language, a persistent Rh-negative blood type, a DNA report flagging a distinct Basque segment, but genetics and vocabulary only explain what a family carried across the ocean. They do not explain how it got to a small town in Idaho, Nevada, or California in the first place, or why the paperwork along the way so often points somewhere else entirely. For that part of the story, the search moves out of the laboratory and into three specific, well-documented waves of migration that most family historians never think to search by name, one beginning centuries before the United States existed at all, one built almost entirely around a single American industry, and one hidden in plain sight inside the very paperwork meant to record it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The paper trail actually starts earlier than most people expect, more than 3 centuries before anyone thought to build a boarding house in Idaho. Basque sailors were whaling and fishing the coast of what is now Newfoundland and Labrador as early as the 1530s, decades before England or France established a permanent colonial foothold anywhere on the eastern seaboard of North America. Archaeologists excavating the site of Red Bay, on the Labrador coast, uncovered the remains of a fully operational Basque whaling station, complete with rendering ovens, a cooperage, and the wreck of at least one Basque galleon, all dated to the mid to late 1500s. That station processed whale oil that lit lamps across much of Europe for the better part of a century, run largely by Basque crews from the ports of Donostia, Bayona, and Getaria. Basque names also run directly through the early administrative history of Spanish America in a way that rarely makes it into a standard textbook. Juan de Oñate, who led the expedition that established the first Spanish colony in what is now New Mexico in 1598, came from a prominent Basque family in Gipuzkoa. Ignatius of Loyola, born Íñigo López de Loyola in the Basque town of Loyola, founded the Jesuit order, whose missionaries spread across Spanish colonial territory from California to Paraguay over the following 2 centuries, carrying Basque surnames into mission registries the length of 2 continents. Juan Sebastián Elcano, born in the Basque fishing town of Getaria, took command of the Victoria after Ferdinand Magellan was killed in the Philippines and completed the first full circumnavigation of the globe in 1522, and the Basque shipbuilding and merchant tradition he came from, organized for centuries through the Consulado de Bilbao trading guild, went on to dominate a large share of Spain's colonial shipping trade. Even the family of Simón Bolívar traced its surname to the small Basque town of Bolívar in Vizcaya, a detail genealogists have documented through Spanish colonial land and church records connecting the South American liberators' paternal line back across the Atlantic. None of this means every Basque surname buried in an early colonial record connects directly to your specific family tree, and no responsible genealogist would claim otherwise without a documented line connecting the generations in between. But it does mean a Basque surname appearing in an early Spanish colonial parish register, a mission baptismal record, or a land grant document from California, Texas, or New Mexico is not an anomaly. It reflects a real and well-documented pattern of Basque involvement in the earliest waves of Spanish exploration, administration, and missionary work across the Americas, centuries before the migration most people associate with Basque American identity today. The migration most people do associate with Basque American identity began later, and it left a far denser paper trail. Starting around the 1850s during the California Gold Rush, and accelerating heavily between about 1900 and the 1950s, tens of thousands of young Basque men, overwhelmingly from Vizcaya and Nafarroa, left for the American West to work as itinerant sheep herders. The work suited the geography. Sheepherding across the open range of Nevada, Idaho, California, and Wyoming meant months of near-total isolation, and Basque men arriving with little English and often no family already established in the country found that isolation more manageable than an unfamiliar city, and considerably more profitable than sharecropping back home. What made the migration traceable today is the network that grew up around it. Basque-owned boarding houses, called Ostatuak in Euskara, sprang up in towns along the migration routes, most famously in Boise, Idaho, Winnemucca, and Elko in Nevada, and Bakersfield in California. These were not simply hotels. They functioned as employment offices, informal banks, translation services, and mail drops for men who spent most of the year alone with a flock of sheep in open country. A new arrival would typically stay at one of these boarding houses for weeks while a job was arranged, and the guest registers many of these establishments kept, some of which survive in local historical societies and university archives today, record names, home villages, and arrival dates in enough detail to reconstruct a specific migration route from a specific Basque town straight to a specific American county. Boise still holds an annual Basque cultural festival called Jayaldi, drawing tens of thousands of visitors from the diaspora community once every 5 years, and its downtown Basque block preserves several of the original boarding houses as museums and cultural centers today. Many family surnames were simplified or respelled during this exact period, often at the boarding house itself rather than at the port of entry, as proprietors who spoke both Euskara and English helped new arrivals fill out paperwork for the first time. If your family surname sounds vaguely Spanish but does not quite match any Spanish naming pattern you can find, and family history mentions Idaho, Nevada, Wyoming, or the Central Valley of California anywhere in the early 20th century, the boarding house registers connected to that specific migration wave are one of the more productive and underused genealogical resources available for tracing exactly this kind of ancestry. The migration was significant enough that it eventually reshaped federal immigration policy itself. Ranchers in Nevada, Idaho, and California faced such a persistent shortage of experienced sheep herders after the Second World War that Congress passed dedicated legislation in 1950 and again in 1952, specifically easing entry for Basque herders, an unusual case of a single, comparatively small ethnic community shaping its own line item in American immigration law. Many of the family and boarding house records from this period are preserved today at the Center for Basque Studies at the University of Nevada, Reno, established in 1967 and now home to one of the largest archives of Basque diaspora material anywhere outside Europe, including oral histories, boarding house ledgers, and sheep camp employment records that regularly help American families connect a great-grandfather's name back to a specific village. The seventh sign is less a piece of evidence than an explanation for why the other six so often go unnoticed in the first place. The United States immigration system, from Ellis Island through the smaller West Coast ports that many Basque immigrants actually used, recorded nationality according to the passport or the port of departure, not ethnicity. Because the Basque Country has never existed as an independent, internationally recognized state, there was no box on any immigration form for a Basque immigrant to check. A man who left through the French port of Bayona was recorded as French. A man who left through the Spanish port of Bilbao was recorded as Spanish. The clerk processing the paperwork had no category for Basque and, in most cases, no particular reason to ask further, since the distinction meant little to the bureaucracy processing thousands of arrivals a week. That single administrative gap is the reason so many American families today carry a vague, half-remembered identity of French or Spanish ancestry that does not quite match anything else about the family. The surname does not look typically French or Spanish. The language grandmother spoke was not standard French or Spanish. Nobody in living memory can explain exactly which region the family actually came from. The paperwork simply never asked the right question, and the answer that got written down was the closest available approximation rather than the truth. Some shipping lines serving the ports of Bilbao and Bayona informally used labels like Spanish Basque or French Basque on their own internal passenger lists, since agents working those routes knew the difference even when the government did not. But those informal notations rarely made it past the shipping company's own paperwork and almost never appear on the official immigration record a descendant finds today. This is precisely the gap that a modern DNA test, a close look at a surname structure, or a boarding house register from Boise or Winnemucca can finally close, sometimes more than a century after the immigration form was filled out. Genealogists researching Basque American ancestry today routinely find this exact pattern: a family with documented French or Spanish immigration paperwork, a surname that does not cleanly fit either national tradition, and once the Basque provinces specifically are searched instead of France or Spain broadly, parish records, civil registries, and even those boarding house guest books start producing matches that generic French or Spanish research never turned up at all. Taken together, these 7 signs rarely arrive as a single dramatic discovery. They tend to surface slowly, one at a time, usually without anyone planning it that way. A relative gets curious about a surname that never quite fit its supposed national origin. A DNA test comes back with an unexpected regional flag. Someone remembers, almost as an afterthought, that a great-grandmother used to say a few words in something that was definitely not Spanish. A little digging turns up a name in a boarding house register from Nevada or Idaho, matched to a home village in Vizcaya or Nafarroa that nobody in the family had heard mentioned in decades. None of these signs, taken alone, proves a documented bloodline. Genealogical proof requires the harder work of connecting each generation to an actual record, a baptismal entry, a ship manifest, a naturalization file, a census page, all the way back to a specific person in a specific Basque town. But together, these 7 signs describe a population and a migration pattern specific and well documented enough that the search is very often worth beginning. The Basque Country remains one of the smallest and most genetically distinct regions in all of Western Europe, a language isolate wrapped around a bloodline that predates most of the population movements that shaped everyone else on the continent. For the descendants of the men who left it, on whaling ships bound for Labrador in the 1500s, on immigrant steamers bound for New York and San Francisco in the 1900s, or simply carried west by rail to a sheep camp in Nevada, the story rarely stayed intact past 2 or 3 generations. But it did not disappear. It sits quietly in a surname, in a blood type, in a boarding house ledger, and in a segment of DNA waiting for someone in the family to finally go looking for it. The search itself has gotten considerably easier in the last 2 decades. Civil registry offices across Bizkaia, Gipuzkoa, Araba, and Nafarroa have digitized large portions of their 19th and early 20th century records, and church parishes across the region have worked with genealogical societies to make baptismal and marriage registers searchable online rather than locked inside a single archive drawer in a single town hall. The Center for Basque Studies archive is open to remote researchers. Several regional Basque genealogical societies, on both the Spanish and French sides of the border, respond to inquiries from American descendants specifically because they field this exact question often enough to have a standard process for it. A surname, an approximate decade of arrival, and a rough guess at an American state where a family first settled is frequently enough for a specialist familiar with the boarding house networks to narrow a search to a handful of villages within a single afternoon. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.